Man is going to the moon. It's not a question of when, it's a question of who gets there first. A small handful of wealthy industrialists and investors has foreseen the importance of such an endeavor, and these visionary men have gotten together to build one of mankind's most audacious creations, an atomic rocket designed to get 4 men onto the lunar surface. But with potential saboteurs at their heels, skeptics giggling at their backs, and the US government breathing down their necks, they must work quickly to make it there in time. Even though the mission proves to be a success when the 4 men find themselves walking on our celestial satellite, a terrible miscalculation might doom them to roam the barren landscape forever, never to return home. Even in its earliest years, cinema has held a unique fascination with men going to the moon. One of the most iconic images from the nascent years of the art is that single shot from Georges Méliès's A Trip to the Moon, with the rocket stuck in the moon's eye. The first film to ever be based on a science fiction novel was 1919's adaptation of H.G. Wells' own The First Men in the Moon. And even today, decades after such fantasies have become reality, we still make movies about the journey, though now they tend to be historical dramas instead of speculative works of science fiction. It's no surprise, therefore, that when the Hungarian-American filmmaker George Pal decided to make what he considered to be the first serious attempt at a science fiction film, he chose as his subject a manned mission to the moon. Pal had a tentative contract to make 2 films for independent film studio Eagle Lion Films, on which he'd staked his entire career in live-action filmmaking. He was known at the time as a puppeteer and animator who had done work for Paramount Pictures. He had earned an honorary Oscar for his pioneering techniques, but he wanted to do more with his career. The first film he produced for Eagle Lion, called The Great Rupert, was designed around his strengths, a live-action romantic comedy about a squirrel named Rupert, which was a stop-motion puppet he designed. The film starred Jimmy Durante and Terry Moore and was directed by Irving Peichel. Despite earning something of a cult status in recent years, The Great Rupert was a miserable financial flop, and if Pal's second film performed the same way, his career as a film producer would never have gotten off the ground. Still, Pal was confident that the world was ready for an accurate science fiction film, and he again hired Irving Peichel to direct what would eventually be known as Destination Moon. Eagle Lion and Pal co-funded the project for a total of around $600,000, which was a lot of money for an independent film, but a fairly low budget for the kind of special effects heavy spectacle Pal envisioned. For the initial screenplay, he brought on James O'Hanlon and Alfred Rip von Runkel, and their initial script was heavily reworked by science fiction legend Robert Heinlein, who turned it into a very loose adaptation of his novel Rocket Ship Galileo. The two share the basic premise of 4 men flying a rocket to the moon and have a few other commonalities, but Destination Moon wisely omits the kid astronauts and space Nazis of Heinlein's original novel. There are also similarities to Heinlein's subsequent The Man Who Sold the Moon, but given that he published that after Destination Moon premiered, it's difficult to say which inspired which. Heinlein also served as the film's technical advisor, and he, Pal, and Peichel all strove to make the film as realistic as possible, to imagine what it would really be like to send men to the moon. The filmmakers also consulted one of the grandfathers of modern rocketry, Hermann Oberth, who also served as Fritz Lang's technical advisor on Die Frau im Mond, another attempt at serious science fiction that dealt with similar subject matter. Modern audiences who can read about missions to the moon in history books might have a hard time understanding what's so special about Destination Moon. It tells a fairly basic story that isn't too far off from how space travel generally works. However, audiences in 1950 weren't readily familiar with many concepts the space age would later teach us, things like the realities of zero gravity and the unintuitive physics of spaceflight, so the simple situations and problems presented in Destination Moon were largely new and alien to them. Perhaps the film's most famous advocate for treating the subject matter with adult sobriety was a children's cartoon character, Woody Woodpecker. Ever since George Pal emigrated from Hungary during World War II, he had been good friends with Woody's creator, Walter Lantz. As a sign of friendship and as something of a good luck charm, Pal tried to get Woody into each of his films. Woody's extended cameo in Destination Moon, in which he is used to demonstrate the principles of a moon flight to a group of investors, was so popular it was eventually used by NASA when the Apollo missions were getting off the ground. This was nearly 20 years before that happened, though, and the film accurately predicted so much of what the future held, it's frankly astounding in hindsight. It saw the technological, nationalistic, economic, and scientific benefits of going to the moon, and it didn't shy away from the enormous challenges inherent in such an endeavor. It did get a few of the basics wrong, like using an atomic-powered rocket and the idea of private industry being the catalyst, but to focus on its failures is to ignore the far greater achievements of Heinlein's futurism. Even the fact that it correctly foresaw the coming space race when nobody else had even conceived of it is a testament to the far-sightedness of its vision. Another technical advisor on staff was artist Chesley Bonestell. Bonestell had worked for years as a matte painter in Hollywood, doing work on such films as Citizen Kane and The Magnificent Ambersons. He then morphed his experiences into creating what would later be called space art, fully rendered depictions of astronomical scenery that used a variety of techniques including clay models, panoramic painting, and photographic trickery. Bonestell had always been interested in a certain degree of accuracy in his work, so it was perhaps inevitable that he would be hired for Destination Moon. The biggest matte Bonestell assembled for the film was a 13-foot-long landscape portrait of the lunar surface, which was placed on a large wheel and rotated around a stationary camera. The stars were made to twinkle by way of holes poked into black material that was passed over a series of different lights at different angles. One bit of artistic license Bonestell allowed was the cracked surface itself, which he knew full well was an inaccurate depiction of the moon's regolith. This is one of the only instances of the film deliberately inserting something the filmmakers knew was unrealistic. Despite the film's special effects looking pretty laughable today, they were astonishing at the time, so much so that the film won an Academy Award for them, which is especially notable when you consider the film's low budget. The effects team found simple, practical ways to accomplish complex shots that had never been attempted before. To mimic the G-forces of takeoff, for example, they used flesh-colored tape and fishing wire, and though the resulting effect is pretty exaggerated, it does effectively demonstrate one of the simple realities of getting out of Earth's gravitational pull. That's what Destination Moon truly excels at, and why it is such an important work of science fiction. As a film on its own merits, it's not particularly great. It's at times amateurish and painfully low budget, especially to more modern eyes, and the plot is surprisingly thin on drama or suspense. Peichel's decision to avoid the expressionist trappings of genre films of the era, be they the German influence on horror or the space opera stylings of Flash Gordon that defined sci-fi prior to 1950, makes for surprisingly dull viewing in places, but it helped to give science fiction a certain degree of credibility to which future greats of the genre like Forbidden Planet and 2001: A Space Odyssey owe their success. It also helped American audiences psychologically accept the plausibility of space travel. It is almost too earnest in its constant attempts to convince you to take the idea seriously. If the plot has a central antagonist, it is skepticism over the idea of getting men to the moon. But it had to be in order to help lay the social groundwork for the space age to come. Destination Moon didn't achieve this in a vacuum, of course, but it undeniably contributed to the mentality that made Apollo 11 a reality. Make no mistakes, audiences were hungry for it too. Eagle Lion gave the film an enormous marketing push long before its release, and it was featured in magazines like Life and Popular Mechanics alongside an exhaustive radio presence that built anticipation to such a fever pitch, a rival studio rushed out a much cheaper film called Rocket Ship XM to capitalize on the delay in Destination Moon's release. Rocket Ship XM came out about a month before Destination Moon, and despite not doing terribly at the box office, its only lasting legacy today is being the subject of the second season premiere of Mystery Science Theater 3000.
However, I must make something clear.
I'm wearing a bra.
Destination Moon premiered on June 27, 1950. Estimates of its financial earnings vary, but the most frequently cited statistics are that the film made somewhere around $5 million that year, which is nearly 10 times its budget. No matter the exact number, its success was assuredly astronomical, and George Pal would parlay that success into a notable career as one of Hollywood's premier science fiction film producers. Not only did the film give us George Pal's future film catalog, which includes When Worlds Collide, War of the Worlds, and The Time Machine, it also made an indelible mark on the history of film itself. It showed that science fiction can be much more than juvenile genre entertainment, and it proved that such an approach could be a box office success. It's no coincidence that the following year, 1951, would see an explosion of sci-fi classics that would define a decade. Cited by none other than Isaac Asimov as the first intelligent science fiction movie made, Destination Moon is where the golden age of science fiction cinema truly begins. And that's all for today, my fellow Earthlings. If you like what I'm doing here, be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. You can also contribute to my Patreon, where you can get early access to my videos, vote on which films you'd like me to cover in the future, and much more. For written reviews of several more science fiction classics, you should check out my website at emcgill.com, where I'm currently spending the summer discussing everything Robert Heinlein, including rocket ship Galileo and Destination Moon. Until next time, though, this is the Unapologetic Geek, telling you to never be ashamed of what you love, as long as you're not hurting anybody.